Hi, Year 12. Okay, going to go through that introduction and body paragraph that we had going today in class so that you can understand what makes it good writing and what makes it bad writing and why it would not be an A range response, how it could potentially be a B range response the way it currently is, but we'll also have a look at what is uh, what can push it up a little bit higher. Okay, so our question was, in your study of the Tempest and hag-seed, how has the context and values of each text influenced your understanding of the intentional connections and disparities between them? So this is about how do you understand what's similar, what's different, and what are the values, and what is the context of each text, and how has it led you to your understanding of the text, of the and how that what is the textual conversation. So as we were saying in class today, you need to bring that rubric into it. Now, as I said to you, I started doing this late at night. I'm not happy with it. It's a first draft. It's a bit all over the shop. You could actually potentially argue that I don't answer the question at all. So I'm going to show you where it's problematic, where it's okay, and what works, how it can be improved so you can apply it to your own writing. So firstly, in an introduction, we need to start with a thesis and a response to the question. What is our overall response to the question? So I've said the re-imaging of text both highlights the resonances and dissonances between texts that both affirm and challenge the values within the text. Such resonances and dissonances are dependent on both the context of the composers and the context of the audience. So firstly, re-imaging is a word from the rubric. So is resonances, so is dissonances, so is values, and again resonances and dissonances here. And then of course so is context, composer, and context of the audience. They are all rubric words. So I'm using my rubric to help me shape my thesis in response to the question. The question always comes from the rubric, and the marking criteria always comes from the rubric. Um, so I've added to it though. I've said it's not just about how they influenced our understanding, but there's also about how they affirm and challenge the values within the text. So I've gone a step further than the question, so that it's about how one text affirms or challenges the values of the other text. So I'm saying that this is what is the intentional connections and disparities. Okay, then moving on. So I've used two sentences to create my thesis. That's okay. Probably better as one sentence, but I think it's okay for it to be two sentences to expand on it a bit. You're not going to be marked down for doing it in two sentences. But if you leave your thesis to the end, we do tend to say that you eventually arrive at your thesis instead of getting there straight away. Um, then what I've done next is I've actually introduced the novels. You always have to do this in your introduction. So William Shakespeare's 1611 tragicomedy The Tempest and Margaret Atwood's 2016 postmodern novel Appropriation hag-seed explore the concept of transformation from one of revenge to compassion that both suggest that texts escape their temporal bounds and yet are contextually bound to the composer's perspectives of humanity. So here I've brought in the values that I'm actually going to talk about. Lots of different values you could talk about. You could talk about theatre itself, meta theatre, loss, imprisonment, power. There's so many things that you can talk about in these texts. You've got a limited amount of time to write these essays, so you don't want to start talking about all of them. What's important is knowing what to write about, and what you leave out is as important as what you know to put in. Um, what I could have done better in this particular part is actually brought in how this, like I've got the context and I've got the values, which is two parts of the question. I could have also brought it in to discuss further the connections and disparities. So it could do with another sentence at the end there about that. Um, Okay, then I've gone into my body paragraph. Now, Module A allows you to talk about context. In fact, you have to talk about context. But your body paragraphs do need to start with a topic sentence. But if you have a look at this topic sentence, I use context as well as values. So Jacobean England saw a paradigm shift in thought from providentialism to self-actualization. So we're going to start talking about self-actualization. I've then expanded on that idea. As such, the development of a compassionate character reflects the Christian humanism, so there's more context just there, ideals of the Jacobean period that enlightenment must be governed by compassion. So here we go, we're going to start talking about compassion, and we can talk about compassion because we've set it up here that we're going to be talking about that. Shakespeare's The Tempest, so now I'm getting back to my text. Shakespeare's The Tempest explores this notion through the characterization of Prospero and his transformation from a man seeking revenge to a virtuous man of empathy and compassion. This echoes what I've got in the introduction, so there's no surprises here for the reader. When we are first introduced to Prospero, we witness a man driven by his desire for revenge who disrupts order through the creation of a tempest that results in his enemies are all knit up. I've changed the words of the quote there and put his in square brackets, so it shows that I've changed the word of the quote, and that's so I can blend it in and make it grammatically correct, although I know it does jar a bit. I arguably, though, this is a little bit too much plot summary, and I don't have a technique. And we've got to remember that this is a how question. So how is about representation. So we've got to have those language forms and features in there. So this here is what I would call a weak sentence. And I would suggest that it would have to be done a lot better than that to lift it up into an A range. Such desire for revenge is reflected in hag-seed and Felix's soul drift to purpose and need for atonement. So I have integrated my discussion and I've linked hag-seed and the tempest together, which you need to be doing. Then I go into a linking word. Arguably, Prospero's desire for revenge is an altruistic one, as he states to Miranda, "I've done nothing but in care of thee." Yet the audience's position. So again, not a T sentence. I don't actually have the language forms and features there, which I should have, which would just lift it a little bit more. But I do have audience positioning, which is an important one because we are talking about our understanding of the text. So yet the audience is positioned to see through such altruism to the egotistical, self-centered man behind such claims to a man that prides himself on, and we've got another quote, on the love of his people, the love his people bore him. So blending in of quotes is a really good thing to make sure it flows in the sentence. Which Prospero himself, let me turn off these things for you, which Prospero himself contrasts against Antonio's evil nature, another quote. Likewise, linking word, and I'm bringing in Atwood. So now you can see I'm getting similarities in. Atwood also positions the audience in a similar vein through the limited third-person narrative. Finally, language forms and features. That only presents Felix's perspective, leading to one of the similarities between the texts. So I'm making reference to the similarities, and I'm also bringing in perspective because it's part of the rubric. Both texts take on a limited narrative. It is through Prospero. Okay, now I'm talking about both text and form, and that is important to get into your writing because it's a rubric requirement. And now I start to actually get into T sentences. So it is through Prospero's eyes that Miranda and, in turn, the audience are introduced to Prospero. The repetition of the demanding, "Dost thou attend me?" not only demonstrates that we are to see the characters through Prospero's perspective, but that we are witnessing a man that is consumed by his own self-importance that has fueled his desire for revenge. After all, he does state that his library was dukedom enough, so why seek revenge? Couple of things I'm doing here, semicolon, I'm using some more sophisticated punctuation. I'm even asking a question in there, which I'm going to answer as I go through my essay, which is important too. It shows that you are engaging with the audience and you are thinking about these things. Remember, this is a how question, and the module A requires compare and contrast. What are the dissonances? What are the resonances? So these are all showing that I understand what the rubric wants me to do. It is through the textual conversation, and I'm using textual conversation because that's the name of our module. It is through the textual conversation with hag-seed and Felix's own self-gratification in his own productions, placing him in the spotlight, that we understand that ultimately, and you know what? It'd be really nice if there was a quote here about when he talks about being in the spotlight, which I think is in chapter 1. It would benefit from that extra bit of textual evidence there to push it up a little bit higher into the marking range. Placing him in the spotlight, that we understand that ultimately, it's a good word because it's a word of evaluation and you need to be evaluating in advanced English. That we understand that ultimately both texts are presenting protagonists that are seeking revenge, not because they have been fundamentally wronged, but because their egos have been humiliated. However, okay, so now I'm going to go against what I've just said. I've said that, Felix and Prospero are just self-centered egos, and that, it's all about revenge. And yet, we're talking about transformation. So now I've got to go against that. And you can start a paragraph. However, I'm now going to argue against myself. That's a good thing to do in Module A. However, it is the nature or severity of the humiliation that, now notice here, I have echoed what I have here, which shows that my thoughts are moving from one to the other, from one paragraph to the other, and that they're linked and that they're tied. However, it is the nature or severity of the humiliation that not only reveals the different context, that should be different, let's fix that, different context of the composers, but alters the transformation to compassion. Okay, so now I've got my topic sentence. It links to this here. It also brings in the different contexts of the composers, so it links to my question, and it brings back the values that I said I'm going to be talking about. Unlike the self-actualization of the Christian humanists that arose in the Jacobean period, so that is a direct echo of this up here, so everything's still linked together. Unlike the self-actualization of the Christian humanists that arose in the Jacobean period, Atwood's Felix is bound to our own context, where the demands of employment take priority over family, the desire for his individual fame takes priority over selfless compassion for others. Just as Prospero hides his, and then I fell asleep when I was typing this up and I didn't finish it for you. But it gives you an idea. So from here I would then be going into, so just as Prospero hides his, I don't even know what I was going to say, hides his powers, he hides everything, and he hides the truth from Miranda. And then Felix also, the tempest, the metaphorical tempest for Felix is the loss of his job. You would think it was the loss of his child, but it's actually the loss of his job. Arguably, you could argue it that way. There's different ways you could argue it. And then I would go into my T sentences, and again, how is the audience positioned? How does it reveal context? How is this value come through? And I would eventually I would probably have a few more body paragraphs that bounce around the idea of revenge through to compassion, and how both texts influence each other and have that conversation, and what's similar and what's different. So here, unlike the self-actualization, I'm going to be talking about what's different now. How is Felix different to Prospero? I would probably go into it more and say, arguably Prospero's been self-centered, and you could argue from some of this evidence up here, dost thou attend me, and all of that, and Lyra was duped him enough that Miranda is not as significant for him. And yet I would then talk about how Prospero actually wants Ferdinand to work for Miranda's love. Miranda is the rightful spouse of Ferdinand according to the divine chain of being, and yet Prospero wants Ferdinand to work for it because he wants him to truly love Miranda, so that her prize, the wedding, is not just because of the divine chain of being, but because it is out of love, and that is a compassionate move as well. And then I would probably talk about Ariel, and I would get to the greater virtue is in vengeance, and I would bring in some of Prospero's lines from the end of the play as well. And when he talks about virtue, the greater virtue is it's the virtue. Sorry, virtue rather than vengeance. He's also talking about his nobler reason, and you could talk about the actual use of the word nobler and how it relates to Christian humanism